Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special segment of York Universe. I'm Harrison Ruess. We are privileged this evening to be speaking with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen.
Yeah, it's great to be speaking with everyone tonight. And, astronomy just has such a profound impact on me and others who fall into its trap, if you will, gazing out beyond the planet Earth and taking in and the mass, just how immense the universe is and how impossible it is for me, at least, to understand. So this will be a fun conversation.
And we're, of course, also joined this evening by York Universe's own Paul Delaney and Ryan Marciniak.
Good evening.
One of the interesting things, Jeremy, you're just mentioning about gazing out into the universe, of course, Chris Hadfield has opened a lot of people's eyes to what's, of course, on the surface of the Earth, but also the possibilities of what's out there in space. Maybe with your experience in training on the Soyuz and down at Johnson Space Center, maybe walk us through a bit what Chris is going through to get ready to return to Earth, what sorts of things he's packing up, what's it like getting into that Soyuz and then quite literally falling back down to Earth. What's that journey like?
Yeah, getting ready to leave, I think, has a lot of effort. There's a lot of effort put into that. Obviously, we have a lot of checklists to make sure that everything's working right. So leading up to the landing, they're going to get in the Soyuz. They're going to activate some systems, make sure that everything is working right. It's been basically in a sleep mode for the entire time it's been docked to the space station, always ready to go in case we need it as a lifeboat, but essentially powered down for the most part. And then doing some things like making sure their suits are in good shape. They still have pressurization capability in their reentry suits, getting in the chair and making sure that they actually still fit in the seat of the Soyuz. They've been in space for, in Chris's case, 5 months. So, we know that the spine elongates a little bit while you're in space in microgravity, and you've been working out in a different regime than you were doing on the planet, and maybe it doesn't fit quite right, and we have to make some adjustments. So those are kinds of things they're checking out leading up to it. Of course, all their things that they took to space that they want to bring back, so that each astronaut actually gets a small amount of mass, so about let's say 1.5 kilograms that they can put in the Soyuz to bring up with them and bring down. So they're gathering those things up to make sure they're ready to go. And then on the actual day of the landing, there's a long process of saying the goodbyes, sealing the hatches, getting in, final checkouts of the vehicle, and then getting on the timeline to leave the station, do your deorbit burn, and then coming back, plummeting through the atmosphere to a very rough and aggressive entry and landing in a Soyuz vehicle.
That sounds like quite the journey.
I was kind of curious of what was the hiring process like? I mean, this is a job that you got that 5,000 to 10,000 people are all applying for, and you've clearly been able to set yourself apart. So I was just wondering if you could take us through that process and give us kind of the inside scoop on what that was like.
The recruitment process was really a journey in itself. It was very fascinating. It lasted a year. It started off with things you would expect, where you're writing letters, you're filling out some forms online, and then you're writing a letter and explaining why you think you would be suited for the job, and then some preliminary medical investigations in your local area, and then after that we did our first interview. It was via video teleconference, and it wasn't until about 7 months later where 40 of us got together in Montreal at the Canadian Space Agency for a week of testing. And, that involved many different facets, but some aircrew type examination questions, robotic arm training and evaluation to assess your learning curve, some physical training testing, and leading up to going to Halifax. I think we were down to about 30 people at that point, where we went through the battle damage simulators that the Navy has and the helicopter dunkers, and then back for some more a lot of medical testing after that, and finally into the final interviews and actually doing some testing with teaching kids. They assessed us in teaching kids and interacting with kids and speaking with the media. So a tremendous journey, and the most special aspect of it was the people. I just met some amazing people that I still keep in touch with infrequently. As I travel around the country, I run into some of them, and they're just amazing people. And I was very fortunate. Through the whole process, I always assumed I wouldn't be picked. It just didn't seem probable. I'm no one special. I'm just a Canadian. I've had some amazing opportunities in my life and have some great experiences, and I've been taught some skill sets that are useful for this job, but I never thought I'd be picked. And in the end, I was chosen. I felt very privileged and in some cases lucky. But what I say to people a lot is, if we needed 100 astronauts instead of 2 in that selection, you can be guaranteed we would have been able to find 100 Canadians or more who could have done the job. So as with everything, timing and luck sometimes come into play too.
Wow, that's fantastic.
You commented a little earlier in the interview, Jeremy, about astronomy, which I perked up my ears considerably because I am an astronomer.
Yes.
Where did astronomy fit into your early development as a scientist and then eventually into being an astronaut?
Well, I would say growing up on a farm, I lived in a dark area of the planet, and I saw the stars growing up and spent time gazing up at them and the moon, and I didn't really have an introduction into astronomy until I was in university and I learned some basics about astronomy. But as I have gone through life, I just pay attention to things that are out there, and one thing that's really inspired me has been the Hubble Space Telescope and some of the results we've seen from that. And when I go around, I speak to Canadian youth and the adults as well. I often show a few pictures that I find particularly inspiring. I usually use the Orion Nebula. I just find that photo to be absolutely mind-blowing. And I was actually out camping with my kids. I have 2 7-year-olds and an 8-year-old, and I was out camping a couple of weeks ago, and we were looking at the Orion constellation, and I was showing them where the Orion Nebula was, and we could just barely make it out. But then I showed them when we got home a picture of what was really there, and that for me, it just is magical to realize how much we've learned in the time we've been here and how little we really know.
No argument from me, mate, none whatsoever. Speaking of sort of projects, the Hubble Space Telescope stands out as arguably one of the greatest triumphs of both sort of astronomy, space science, space exploration, the shuttle program over the last 20 years. In your mind, what CSA projects stand out to be the most significant, either in the past or present, perhaps even in the future? What, in your mind, has the Canadian Space Agency really got its teeth into?
Well, I would never say the Space Agency had one big success. It would be more of the continuous steps we've been taking with the Canadian Space Agency. That's what impresses me most. If you look back to its history, we were the third country, Canada was the third country to launch a satellite into space, to build one and have it launched into space. And then we focused on things like communications, which opened up the ability for Canadians across this vast country to communicate with one another, and into remote observation. The amount that we've learned about our planet from remote observation and how much and the contribution it makes, and the things we take for granted, the knowledge we have, and the daily monitoring we have to assess the planet is incredible. And then Canadarm, you'd be remiss if you didn't talk about Canadarm, the fact that we helped build the International Space Station. So the key point out of all of that is the fact that Canada is a small country with respect to gross domestic product and the population, but yet we've been a major player in a significant field. And that's something that I think has given a lot back to Canadian industry and to Canadians, and it's just a smart choice. And that's the kind of thing, that's the heritage that we will continue to build upon as we go forward and do more amazing things in space.
Where do you see yourself in 10 years? Do you have a sort of projected, hopeful timeline for your entry into the space environment?
When I find space is an unknown for me. As an astronaut, you train, you prepare, you contribute to the program, you look for areas that you can make a bigger contribution, and then you wait for your opportunity. So for me, I don't know when that'll be yet. Canada's next slots haven't been announced. And I was recruited 3.5 years ago at David St. Jacques, so right now there's 2 of us in line to fly. Obviously, one will fly first and one will fly second. That's an obvious thing. But what I kind of look at is the trend we're seeing with these commercial vehicles being built in the United States right now. So it looks like we're going to be launching people to North America. We're going to have multiple options to get into low Earth orbit. But what is more important is the fact that the price is coming down. And that's going to allow us to take steps beyond low Earth orbit. So for me, if I kind of look into the crystal ball, I could imagine that I'd have the opportunity to visit Space Station and do some work there in this decade. And I think it's quite plausible that I'll have the opportunity in my career to leave low Earth orbit and go somewhere beyond that. quite plausibly even the moon or an asteroid. So that's pretty exciting when I think about the opportunities that might lie ahead. But when I look at them, I don't think about them from just my perspective. I see a program that's going to grow. I see humanity really taking the steps out into the solar system, and I see a lot of Canadians flying. I see this becoming a more prominent part of our society, and we've benefited greatly from watching Chris Hadfield be in space and on the International Space Station and really bringing space back to those of us who are still on the planet. And I see that kind of living in space and working in space becoming a more everyday thing for us as we move forward.
You're listening to a special conversation on York Universe with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen. I'm Harrison Ruess. We're also joined by Ryan Marciniak and Paul Delaney. Jeremy, you were just talking about all sorts of incredible next steps that are coming, not just for Canadians, but for space exploration around the world. And one of the things that I'm always thinking about are next steps, whether it's something like SpaceX, which you mentioned, or going back to the moon or to an asteroid or maybe to Mars. Of all these sorts of things that you just mentioned, if you could only accomplish just one thing, and I know you're a relatively new astronaut, a relatively young astronaut, but if you could only accomplish one thing as an astronaut, what would that be?
It's a tough pick. Certainly the moon and Mars, you'd have to kind of mull that over in your mind. The moon is very romantic to me because we can stand on our planet and look back at the moon and we can see the moon rise. And I just look at pictures, the Earthrise pictures from the moon, and I just imagine exploring the moon and standing on that surface and watching the Earth rise. And that just blows my mind, to stand on another planetary body and be able to look back at planet Earth. And I think that would be a truly profound experience and a real privilege as a human being to do that. So that's always captured my imagination, and I think there's so many great reasons to go back to the moon. I think we've landed in a few sites, and to think we know the moon is very naive. There's so much more to learn. I think we could really get into in situ resource utilization on the moon and really benefit from going to the moon and setting up kind of a hub for our solar system, a place you go to get some resources and then head out into the solar system. So I could see us doing that, and that would be a real privilege for me. But also to go to Mars. When I look at some of the pictures that Curiosity sends back, I see a beautiful place to explore. I've been to places on planet Earth that those pictures remind me of. Some beautiful camping places or hiking places, almost desert-like. I think that would be something significant to go on a journey like that. That's quite an adventure. So I don't know that I could pick. Someone will have to pick for me, or maybe do both.
Both is probably not a bad one. I remember one of the most striking images to me always when looking at astronomical pictures. I think the Spirit rover took it a few years ago, and it was a picture of Mars and part of the sky. And in the sky, there was this one little spot of light, and that spot of light was Earth. Of course, on Earth, usually we look up and you can see Mars, but there's this picture from Mars looking back and you can see Earth. And I get goosebumps just thinking about that. And for you to, even potentially have the ability to maybe see that for real, that's a pretty cool treat.
And something else that's worth mentioning, when we had the Apollo program, amazing things were accomplished, and there were a lot of technological benefits to humanity. But it was a short program, it was very expensive, and it came to a logical conclusion at that point in time with respect to finances, I would say. But as we step forward this time into the solar system, I see us developing a transportation system that's reusable, that's much more economical, that's sustainable into the future. I don't see us going on these one-shot wonders to a new place and that being the end. I see us setting up a system that we use and more people travel more along the lines of what it's like right now on Earth with respect to airline transportation. I see us moving into that age. When you see commercial companies getting involved, I think that's a pretty significant step.
Jeremy, it's interesting that you were talking about Mars and just how romantic that is. And you mentioned earlier about how part of your interview process, seeing how you work with kids and work with the media. And, I think you being a role model is hugely important in becoming an astronaut in the first place. When I do shows for kids at the Ontario Science Centre, one of the questions I ask them is who wants to be the next astronaut to go to Mars, or who wants to be the first astronaut on Mars? And it's amazing how many hands actually go up. And so what I wanted to know is something that I can tell these kids. What advice do you have for all these young kids who share this amazing dream of becoming an astronaut, and all these kids that are kind of finding this dream, seeing you and seeing Chris Hadfield and the things that you guys are doing?
I didn't make this advice up. It's some advice I profited from throughout my life that I picked up from other people. But it's very simple. You find your passion in life. Everyone has things that they love to do, and some things they don't love to do quite as much. And for some people, that's science and technology. For others, it's arts programs. And you need to find your passion in life. And when you do that, then you will excel at the things you do. You will enjoy what you're doing. You will be inventive. You'll be creative, and you will excel. And then when you excel at something, amazing opportunities present themselves. And so I always guard people against looking at someone else's path if that's where they want to end up. If you want to be an astronaut, don't necessarily follow Chris Hadfield's path or Jeremy Hansen's path. Find your passion in life and follow that passion, and you'll see that it will lead you on an amazing adventure. And set your goal on being an astronaut and keep that door open and always work towards it, but enjoy every step along the way as you follow your passion, and you'll see it leads to amazing opportunities.
You've got lots of differing aspects of your life there, Jeremy. Some are fun-filled, some are undoubtedly challenging. What do you do to deal with the limelight, with all these interviews like the one that you're going through now, which pop up at the strangest of times? What would you think is the most challenging part of being an astronaut?
Well, with respect to public outreach, I think that's just a privilege that you have to speak to others, to go around, in my case, mostly around Canada and meet interesting people and share my adventures with them and then hear about their adventures in their lives. So I find that to be a privilege and not so much of a challenge. But with respect to the overall astronaut training, I'd have to say the most challenging aspect is the spacewalk training. You're preparing yourself to go outside a vehicle that's keeping you alive and into the vacuum of space, and you need this enormous spacesuit that weighs at least a couple hundred kilograms here on planet Earth, and you have to be very adept at working in this spacesuit before you decide to venture outside into the vacuum of space. So we train in an enormous pool in Houston, Texas, at the Johnson Space Center, and the training is very demanding. You get in the spacesuit, you go in the morning, you prepare all your tools and your plan. You're in the spacesuit in the water, probably getting in the spacesuit around 8:30 in the morning. You're working in it till 3, and they pull you out. So you end up spending, by the time you get out of the suit, about 7 hours in this spacesuit. And then you're just working the whole day long with no breaks, no lunch break. And it's very physically demanding and mentally demanding, but just so rewarding to imagine stepping out into space and then gazing back at our planet through nothing more than just that thin pane of glass. That, for me, is very motivating. And sometimes when I'm underwater and floating around in the suit and doing work, I imagine what it would be like if the pool floor wasn't there one day and I was actually looking down at the ocean or the continent and just zooming overhead.
You've been listening to a very special interview here with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen here on York Universe with Ryan Marciniak and Paul Delaney. Folks, we've actually come to the end of our time with Jeremy. I'd like to thank him very much for joining us and everyone here on the astronomy.fm virtual radio dial. Jeremy, do you have any final words before we part?
Yeah, absolutely. I encourage everyone to keep looking out into our universe on the behalf of humanity and keep educating the people on this planet. We're all in this together on Spaceship Earth, and I think astronomy goes a long way to making people realize how fragile our existence is in this enormous universe, and astronomers are a key player in the future of humanity. So thanks for your interest in doing that and for bringing the general public along with you.
And of course, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us and everyone else as you do. If any listeners want to connect with Jeremy, his Twitter handle is at @astro_Jeremy. And of course, you can connect with us on York Universe at yorkuniverse.com and on Twitter at York Universe. On behalf of Paul Delaney and Ryan Marciniak, I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in to York Universe and our conversation with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen.
entire time it's been docked to the space station, always ready to go in case we need it as a lifeboat, but essentially powered down for the most part. And then doing some things like making sure their suits are in good shape. They still have pressurization capability in their reentry suits, getting in the chair and making sure that they actually still fit in the seat of the Soyuz. They've been in space for, in Chris's case, 5 months. So, we know that the spine.
Yep. What's it like getting into that Soyuz and then quite literally falling back down to Earth? What's that journey like?
Yeah, getting ready to leave, I think, has a lot of effort. There's a lot of effort put into that. Obviously, we have a lot of checklists to make sure that everything's working right. So leading up to the landing, they're going to get in the Soyuz. They're going to activate some systems, make sure that everything is working right. It's been basically in a sleep mode for the entire into its trap, if you will, gazing out beyond the planet Earth and taking in and the mass, just how immense the universe is and how impossible it is for me, at least, to understand. So this will be a fun conversation.
And we're, of course, also joined this evening by York Universe's own Paul Delaney and Ryan Marciniak.
Good evening.
One of the Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a very special segment of York Universe. I'm Harrison Ruess. We are privileged this evening to be speaking with Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen.
Yeah, it's great to be speaking with everyone tonight. And, astronomy just has such a profound impact on me and others who follow.
The interesting things, Jeremy, you're just mentioning about gazing out into the universe. Of course, Chris Hadfield has opened a lot of people's eyes to what's, of course, on the surface of the Earth, but also the possibilities of what's out there in space. Maybe with your experience in training on the Soyuz and down at Johnson Space Center, maybe walk us through a bit what Chris is going through to get ready to return to Earth, what sorts of things he's packing.